Great. So, I'm sitting here and I don't have like an amazing question sheet with all the most smartest and bestest question. So I'm relying on you here. I'm relying on you to not have asked these wonderful people the questions you have prior to this. But I think it was great talks, and I was like all of the different talks had a great different take on everything, like from talking about anthropomorphism and new technology and the spinning roulette wheel to actually writing code and then history of software crisis and where do we go next. And you know, um, I think this was really interesting. Um, but I think I can maybe start off with like you both addressed like at least Adam and Mattias regarding this where we are on the curve, so to say, and like you use the television for radio programs, and we're like height of the peak, or maybe we're a bit below. But if I mean, I like to sort of like if you think of in a fantasy world, or if you try to use your creativity, like where do you think we will all like what would be a good use for this spinning roulette wheel to spit out text, sort of in one of its current forms. Like what would you say would be a different use case than sort of answering factual questions about German leaders? Oh yeah, sorry, the microphones. They might need to be turned on, and you have two so you can share. You try again?
Nope. Okay, excellent. Should I go first? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Copilot is the perfect example of what we should be using now, and it works really well, and it's been working well for quite some time. I mean, it's the perfect assistant for writing code. It's like you're having, 10 of your best programmer friends sitting next to you, cranking out code much faster than 10 of your best friends, right? And you learn so much from that. So I think the benefit from that is not just that it writes a bunch of code for you so you don't have to. Right? I think that's the wrong kind of takeaway from it. Like I said in my talk at the end, it's a different thing for me now to write code than it was a year or 2 years ago, right? Or for the previous more than 30 years that I've been writing code. I do it differently. It's a different thing, generating code, or writing code, whatever you want to call that. It's writing code, but it is producing code, right? But it's much more that you learn so much from it. You become a better coder, just like you do if you write code with other people. I write code with someone else. And the pace that you can learn from that thing when that is able to do that is so fast. It's much faster than if you can find your 10 best friends to write code just as faster.
Great. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing from my perspective is when I've had some of my team members experimenting with some of this code is that it very much depends on the kind of person and their background as to how well they can take advantage of something like Copilot or ChatGPT. And what I've noticed is for the more experienced coders, there's a greater acceleration. They've got an understanding of those fundamental patterns of software and what should be used in what place. For a mid-level coder, somebody who's partway through their career, there's sort of a hit and miss approach to it. Sometimes they'll get something right and it works great, and they'll understand it. And other times they'll get really pulled up in the PR and, oh, why are you taking this approach? And because ChatGPT told me to, and it isn't always the right thing. And I think for entry-level coders, it's almost sometimes not the right thing unless it's really used in an educated context, querying it and asking it to understand and explain things. So I think one of the interesting things that's also a new application of sort of the concept of ChatGPT, of the roulette wheel, is also when the code tries to predict what should be right and what then compares that to what it encounters. And there are some tools out there like Codeze, which does this. It's spelled a completely unintuitive way, Kodeze, Codeze. What it basically does, it doesn't generate code, but it sort of tells you and explains to you what your code does. It's like the linter in your IDE on steroids, right? It basically takes that and explains the code for you, and you can look at it and go, that's not what I meant. So there are some tools where maybe that kind of a tool is going to be more appropriate for the less experienced engineer, and something that's generative will be more experienced for the more appropriate for the more experienced engineer. We still haven't figured this out. We're still at the very early stages of learning this, and I think there's going to be a lot more tools. I mean, you saw on that hype cycle, there's about 50 things on there, right? There's a lot of different kinds of things on there that come from this concept of spitting stuff out. and some of it's more along the lines of predictive, what should happen next. And so I think there's many different applications that we really haven't wrapped our heads around yet and haven't even started to combine them. Because when you start to combine them, I mean, we talked about thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of variables. Now multiply them. You're getting some really big numbers. Like I don't even know how many zeros are on the end of it, right? That's where it's going to get interesting, really far.
Cool. Do you have anything to add, Karl? I'm thinking about you as well for the your talk, and going. Oh, if you look at the different entry points of using ChatGPT throughout your process and that you showed, and working with it more extensively.
Yeah, I think we should view this as a preview of what's coming more than what we use today, because in like 15 minutes it will be integrated in all the tools we have, and it will be much more easier and convenient to use. You don't have to do that continuing thing, and it will be able to understand the code base you're working with and refactor stuff more easily. So I think people who can code will have really big advantages of this, and when it writes all the boilerplate code for you, it frees up your mind to think about things on a higher level, so you can be much more productive in the big run. And at the same time, as you talk about more junior developers, it can also be problematic to learn to code when it generates so much for you. It's like when Word got spell checkers. No one can spell anymore. Maybe you don't need, but if you are gonna write a book, you will need to be able to spell, right? But so if you write a WordPress site, maybe you don't need to know how to code. But if you write a money transaction system, it's good to know how to code, even though ChatGPT or whatever generative model is producing the code does, right?
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see how that evolves.
And also, sort of speaking to learning, like you when we had our chat prior to this as well, you talked about and we talked about it now, junior developers, like more comparative and maybe not so much generative or stuff like that, but using it in school, speaking of that, how can we as a junior person or a senior person become even better and use this as a tool to improve?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I agree. Thank you guys for bringing it up. I think it's a tool that we all need to learn to use. But I think if you use it for writing code, for instance, if we're talking about that, then you need to learn how to code, or at least what code is. But I think there are tools that will help us with that as well. But in terms of learning, I think a lot of us senior people. So I think there's a lot of people who are seniors, and some people are more interlevel and stuff like that, and more junior. But us seniors, those who are most seniors, needs to kind of, first start using these tools, because they will become used, right? And then you will be able to learn yourselves what's the most efficient use of them. And then you can start mentoring the more junior people in how to use it. So, I mean, one of the most important thing that senior developers, or tasks that senior developers have had, I think, is to mentor more junior developers. Because if you didn't know, there are more junior developers than senior developers, right? And we don't want all those junior developers to be writing all the cool software. We want them to become more senior faster, right? And the only way that's going to happen is by more senior people helping the junior developers, increase their skill set and become better. And if we have more tools that become more powerful, they also need to be, mentored into how to do that properly. And you need to maybe tell them to stop using it because you're using it wrong. You cannot answer. I even heard someone being on an interview, sending in code samples, right, for an actual application, and it was absolute gibberish, and it was clear it was made from ChatGPT. So don't do that if you're a junior developer. If you're a senior developer, if you see someone doing that, just explain to them nicely. Maybe that's stupid. Right?
That's a good answer. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes. Hold on.
When you wrote the first prompt, you said you wrote as a senior front-end developer, blah, 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 blah. What would happen if you wrote like as a junior backend developer?
That's an interesting question. I haven't tried it. It's this is about this prompt engineering stuff. I don't know how much there is into it, but it's trendy, and I've tried it a bit different, and this one used worked well for this example, so I kept it. But it's fun when I did the make the code more enterprising. It actually does something out of that actually makes the code more enterprising. So it's kind of can it will probably do some fun stuff with that prompt as well. So you get very different results depending on the wording of your prompts. So that's something you have to experiment a lot with to get what you want from it. But try it.
That's great. Anyone else? Yes.
Yes, we're a couple of students here, so ChatGPT has been a blessing for us in many ways. However, a couple of us just took a course on statistical language models, and a big thing that we talked about was like the ethics of it, the interpretability part. And I'm wondering, like, what's your view on this? Are we rushing into this technology because it's cool, but without really considering the consequences of it? A bit of like a broader question, but what's your thought about that?
I think the interesting thing about ethics and AI is that there's probably as much written about the ethics as AI as there is code written for AI. There's a lot of opinions out there about it. There's a lot more fear than there is reality. And while I think we're far away from sort of enshrining Asimov's 3 laws or something like that, I think there is a much greater understanding of data bias, data input bias, which obviously results in output bias, than there was even just 3 or 4 years ago. I think when you look at the rate of acceleration of change and especially the rate of complexity, I don't think we'll have too much to worry about. The people who criticize but can't do are all there waiting to pounce and have been for a good while. And I think that'll keep most of the efforts in this area in a line that's acceptable. You know, unless you're working out of North Korea or somewhere like that, you're probably going to be fairly safe in terms of the results that come out. But I also think there's a growing trend now, especially for the larger organizations, to hire and run a group of computer ethics people. Palantir was a company that I worked for, which has done this. They employ 5 people across about a 4,000 employee base who focus just on that. So I think even commercial organizations are taking this into account, and there's a lot more written than is able to be put into practice right now. So I, for one, am not too worried about where this is going. But I think it's obviously also important for all of us to understand the principles that bad data in equals shit out.
Yeah, I think it's there are already regulations for some industries. You talked about healthcare. I used to work with money transaction systems, and there you can't really use that much of AI today because you need to have explainable models. You can't give a credit score on a person based on a magical model that you don't really know what it bases the decision on. So there are regulations in place, and I think that will be maybe more of a problem than for development than what helps at some point. But then if we talk just about code, I think there's a lot of discussion of the copyright issues of what this generates because it has trained the data on existing code and that someone has copyright to. And I don't know where that will land, but will probably not be an issue for so long, in my opinion.
Excellent questions. And also anyone who is not a student, an older, more senior person who's not tried ChatGPT or any of these technologies, follow the students, right? They know what they're doing. So, I mean, there's a lot of ethical issues surrounding a lot of these things, right? And I could sit there and trying to be a good academic and talk about all of those things, but I'm not going to do that because that's boring. No, because we don't have time. Let's say that. Um, I don't have time to phrase myself properly for that. What I think is most interesting and more important is how we use them. And I think that in order to use them well and appropriately and ethically is to understand them better. Start understanding them as this, spinning wheel of fortune rather than brain. Right? There's a lot of stuff going on, like in the background of this, that might have ethical concerns, and we know that bad data in is going to be bad data out, or shit in, shit out. But you can also it has we all have a responsibility of how we use the responses from these models. So if we stick to just kind of this sort of technologies like language models, we have a responsibility for how we kind of interpret and receive this stuff. It's just like as in any sort of communication between people. There's a listener and there's a speaker and a listener, right? So recipient and a sender, and both of them have a responsibility in trying to make sense of what is being said. So you can try this later on. I'm not going to spoil anything, but you can ask ChatGPT to write some code that can tell who to shoot, who to kill based on gender and race, and see what it does. And if you take that as like, oh yeah, that's the code I should write, then you should not write code, and you should go back to school and I don't know, go back to your mom and get some upbringing or something like that. Nothing good is going to come out of that query. Let's just say that.
Yeah, in the corner.
I'm a developer, I'm a security architect. So, of course, yes, my concerns or the current concern would be we are adapting the technology of AI as well as ChatGPT. So, what would be our going forward with the security concern or feature, and also on the copyrights and the privacy and stuff? How do we handle it? It's a topic. Definitely, I'm not expecting a one-word answer or one sentence. It's impossible. We've thought in our organization as well, like maybe 6 months back, when people started buzzing about, hey, ChatGPT, now we need to use it. We don't need to code anymore. So that kind of thoughts. So we were thinking, how do we integrate this? Should we say we disconnect the entire, block all the sites where it's possible? Is it the solution? Definitely not. Why? Because that is not a solution at all. But how do we handle it? So we were still discussing and debating on that. We don't have an answer yet. Maybe want to say something about that.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll bite because this is a fun one. I think so. Having done quite a lot of work in security, often security comes down to what's basically an adversarial problem. It's one person who's trying to achieve something, and the other person trying to normally stop them from achieving it. So, for example, somebody's trying to hack in and steal all of your money from your bank account, and the bank's trying to stop you from getting the money out of there unless you're the correct person, you own the account. And when it comes down to adversarial problems, this is where we're talking about military engineering. It's several thousand years old. Normally what you do, as soon as one side has a tool that's new and novel, then the defending side comes up with a defense tool that basically is almost the same thing but works the other way around. So what I expect will happen is that defense architecture teams will come up with AIs that are trained on the rules of the things that should happen, the rules that shouldn't happen, and they'll use those AIs to basically guard the tram lines and make sure nothing's coloring outside the lines. So they're not necessarily going to stop it to begin with, but they'll be using AI to detect when things aren't right. So then you can use the AI that is, more creative and more generative, and then something else that says that's okay, that's not okay. And then you'll end up with this adversarial problem where each one will get better and better and better until you end up with something that's, if not optimal, then getting on the way towards it. So that's the way I would expect it to happen, just based on human psychology and the way that these things tend to go.
Anyone else? I have a reply to the question. No? No? Any more questions? Yes.
Someone had to do it, right? So I asked ChatGPT to give a smart question to. But I get a lot of boring questions, which I've talked about already. But this one is quite interesting. As large language models becomes more prevalent and accessible, do you see the potential conflicts between their use in facilitating innovation and the potential to stifle creativity and originality by promoting conformity and standardization.
That was a nice one.
Yeah. Actually, if we take this in the context of code, my personal theory is that we will get much more limited in the number of programming languages, and I don't think we will get that many new programming languages going further, because there's no economics in using a new programming language or technology if the AI can generate code for you in the old one that solves your problem at the 10th of the cost. So I think it might stifle some creativity, but that's just a theory, and it will be very interesting to see how that evolves. Also, these models are trained on things that human writes, so if no one writes new things, what will happen? It will be, I see the point of conformity and stifle innovation, definitely, but who knows what the future will bring.
Yeah.
Yeah, a great question. Thank you, ChatGPT. No, I think you're absolutely right in that respect. But I think that there are other ways that we can look at creativity, and I think in the use of these things is going to cause an explosion in creativity, because I think that, like, innovation and creativity comes from trying out different things, right? And as these things allow us to become much more efficient in doing things and trying different things, and because you can just, like we saw a lot of trying, right? And write this, and that's not right, write in this language instead. I mean, if you could do that really, really fast and try different things really, really fast, I just see there's a creativity explosion happening, right? I mean, we're going into recession, but I think this might actually hamper that a little bit. So that would be interesting to see. No, I think it will be good for creativity, but it will come out of the use of it. So I'm sure there will be some conformity in terms of what it comes out of output. But like we said, input is also important, right? And the input can come from us.
Yeah, I think you actually generated the case perfectly. That you generated a whole lot of questions, and you picked the one that was the most interesting. So ultimately, the creativity. I think you just answered your own question the way that you did that. That's one thing. The other thing is to look back in history. So when we first started coding for computers, we coded in assembly, which was a text language that most closely resembled the actual instruction set on the computers. Then we built an abstraction that meant that we could write in C. It was much more common with C, common language, right? And then we didn't have to worry about shuffling pointers around and bit division and so on. And then we went up from C to C++, and we were much less worried about out of bounds memories, checks, constraints, etc. So each time we get a level of abstraction higher, we end up with more creativity, and history shown us that we end up with more code written with every new level of abstraction. And I expect to see the same thing, literally, an explosion in terms of what people are able to do. Because there'll be much more people who are able to code competently once we've worked out some, these first 2, 3, 5, 10 years of bugs that the AI is currently generating in code.
Great, thank you. I think does anybody have any more questions? I would just, oh yeah, one here.
Have you tried any of the image generative AIs like Midjourney, DALL-E, or Stable Diffusion, and what are your experiences or opinions of them?
They are great. No, I think they're really, really cool. I mean, they came out basically before ChatGPT, right? Stable Diffusion. Well, I'm not going to do the timeline. I'll have a lecture on that on Friday if you want to listen. But I mean, they are amazing, and I think the way we can look at them, what I am amazed by, and I think a lot of people are perhaps too, is that the way it can capture things in the images, right? So you write some text prompts that captures some sort of meaning that we have an understanding of it, right? And then through this model, which is partly a text model using clip usually, and an image generator, it can kind of generate images that would resemble that sort of understanding of it. And it's really remarkable that the image, right, has the same sort of content that we would expect us to understand, right? So it's kind of it's almost like it's speaking to us through images, and we come to some sort of agreement. I think that's pretty remarkable. The other remarkable thing about that is that So we're amazed by these sort of, well, we're amazed by the image generators, right? We're also kind of amazed by these large language models. They're quite good. I mean, they don't know stuff, but they're not meant to, again, rolling things. But these large language models, like what would you think intuitively is the largest model? And the size of a model is basically all the parameters or the numbers, stuff going on in them, right? Like, so what is biggest? These image generators that really has to understand all images, all possible images of it that could be, generated in the world, or these language things, which really is just, generating the next word from a sentence, right? Well, intuitively, at least for me, I would think that, of course, the image generated models require much more compute and a much bigger models, right? Much more data in them. And that's completely false, right? They are super small. Like you can run Stable Diffusion on your own computer. You need some memory in them, but basically not that much. If you want to run like GPT-3, you can't. Like Google can, right? And Microsoft can. And these big companies can because they have access to this software, right? So I don't know exactly how big the biggest model you could try on your computer. If you have an RTX 3090, the biggest one I've managed to do is like 150 million parameters, something like that, which is very little. The ChatGPT is, what is it, 127 billion, 175 billion, and the bigger ones are bigger. It's possible they're gonna get smaller because we know better now how language works. But the size of the language models are enormously much bigger than the image generators or the image models. Why is that? That's an open question.
I think what's interesting when you look at the two very different models, the language generators versus the image generators, and who's using them. So stick the image generator in the hands of me, who's a bit of a Luddite when it comes to art or design, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I can create incredible stuff, and I can do it really fast. And some of them actually don't look like I want to throw up when I look at it, right? But then you put it in the hands of a designer, and they look at it in a completely different way, because then they're basically looking like, this is terrible, it's awful, there's no form, there's nothing nice about it. But then they sort of take a step back and have a play with it a bit more, and they start generating lots and lots, like hundreds of images. And you realize, well, I realized that what they were doing when they're doing this is they're basically looking for that creativity. So those tools are useful to them in a completely different way than they're useful to us. They use it to overcome the visual equivalent of writer's block, whereas we use it to generate, lines and squares, equivalent kind of thing. And so I think the use case of some of these tools is very much going to depend on the user group who are using it, and they may well be completely validly useful to different sets of groups, but in completely different ways. And that's still something that we haven't explored, brilliantly. These tools are only available to a very small number of people right now, compared to the number of people on the planet, for example, right? And most people about half people on the planet work, right? But the number of people who have access to these tools, it's a tiny fraction of a tiny bit of a percent. And so when it becomes a lot more widespreadly available, it's going to get interesting.
Because this also, like, this discussion also brings me to a question of how it will, because you talk about it in terms of design when you look at these diffusion models and stuff like that, and how we have talked about creativity and how they use it to be even more creative and to find a form and to develop it. And it seems the same argument for sort of enforcing the gaps between the people who know and the people who don't. Like same thing with senior developers versus entry, like I'm first starting at uni or something like that. That these, it will benefit the people who know much more, at least in the current state maybe, than the people who don't. I mean, spread in terms of domains and different areas of expertise. If you look at code or if you look at sort of design or whatever. Do you have any sort of opinions on that, or how we can decrease the gaps, or what should we do to not have the gaps become so extensive, like so much?
I think this one is actually fairly simple. I mean, this comes down to the innovation of diffusion, the diffusion of innovation, right? We have the early adopters. There's a 2 or 3% who'll go and search out and find the latest, greatest, shiny thing and play with it. They'll get themselves cut on the bleeding edge of stuff, right? And then there is, the late adopters and the laggards, the one who won't touch anything new until they pretty much can't avoid it. And so, how can we make it more widespread? Time. This is a normal distribution. This is really well understood, and I don't think we're going to change human psychology that fast. It's true that innovation is now deployed more quickly than ever. It's just the acceleration of innovation. But I don't think we're going to convince the laggards any quicker to take it on, because they've still got the image of HAL or Terminator in their heads, and that's going to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an opportunity, like in terms of like leveling playing fields or whatever, right? So there will be people who are like artists or programmers or things like that, right? Who will embrace these tools and start using them and become, more efficient or better, or changing the way they do things, right? Changing what they do and changing the way they do it. Yeah. And then there will be some people who are like, this is not for me. But then there will be some people who have not been doing those things, like people who have not been great artists or photographers or working in that space, who will pick up like the image generators or the stable diffusion, the next models like that, who will be like, oh, I'll try this and learn this, and they become great at it. And then there will be like some artists, oh, why are they taking a job? I've done all this. It's like, well, maybe you should start using these tools too, right? So there's like it will mix things up a little bit. But I'm not sure it's going to be for the worse. I think it's going to be for the better for humanity.
Yeah, and you could like invite 60 people to a room and show them how to do it, and then they go on and try it, and then it will spread. Yeah, so I think this is just a preview of what's to come. You can't really work with ChatGPT in a normal programming flow like we did today. You saw how clunky it is, but in a few weeks it will be integrated, and just start trying out and see what it can be useful for and get a feel for it. And I think the use cases will come.
All right. I think that's about it for today. Yes, Linda. You have a question for me?
Yes.
But I'm not ready.
So did you ask ChatGPT how to arrange an event on the topic?
No, I didn't. No, I didn't actually at all. We just did it ourselves. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Well, I think we can. Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking about the future role of the developer. So we have seen already how ChatGPT can create code in several ways. So I was thinking in the future, you mentioned that the drives for developing new programming languages decreased. And so in the future, would the developer focus more on writing like central code and letting this transformer do the actual scripting? Is that how what do you think? Is that how it's going to be? Or to what extent will you still write code?
Yeah. Maybe a quick answer if you have it, and then you can take a discussion afterwards.
Yeah, I just thinking in the competitive programming world, people are quite annoyed that the AI is writing the code better than 52% of all the competitors. That's amazingly good, but the job as a developer is very little about code. And the thing is that the competitive programming problem is very well defined. And the job of a developer is more of defining that problem than writing the code. And AI will not do that anytime soon.
All right. I would like you all to give a warm applause for Adam, Horner, Karl Tillström, and Mattias Rost.